Imagine having juice spilled all over your $5,000 suit at an elite party. Now imagine being the person who spilled it. A minimum wage delivery girl surrounded by millionaires. That moment of humiliation changed 2 lives forever. What happens when a bored CEO decides to rescue this girl from public shame? Richard Stone could have any woman in his wealthy circle, but something about Layla's resilience caught his attention. By the end of this video, you'll see how a simple act of kindness transformed into a multi-million-dollar business and a love story that defied all social barriers. What happens when a simple delivery girl enters a world of wealth she never belonged in? The answer will shock you. Layla rushed through the back entrance of the towering skyscraper, balancing 6 large bags from Oriental Flavor restaurant. The delivery was running late, and her grandmother would be disappointed if they lost this high-paying client. At 25, Layla had been making deliveries for 5 years now, helping keep her grandmother's small restaurant afloat, while juggling 3 other jobs. Tonight's delivery was different. An elite corporate party on the 50th floor, where the minimum net worth for attendance probably exceeded her lifetime earnings. The security guard eyed her suspiciously before reluctantly allowing her access to the service elevator. As the doors opened to the penthouse venue, Layla was momentarily stunned by the opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings twice as high as her apartment, and the guests' jewelry, alone, could probably pay off her student loans. "Where's the kitchen?" she asked a passing waiter, who pointed without making eye contact, the universal language of service staff, acknowledging another, invisible, worker. Layla hurried toward the kitchen, navigating through the crowd of designer dresses and tailored suits. That's when it happened. A sudden shift in the crowd forced Layla to sidestep, catching her foot on an unseen extension cord. The world slowed down as she stumbled forward, the 6 delivery bags tilting precariously. She managed to save 5 of them, but the 6th, containing 4 large cups of the restaurant's signature hibiscus punch, went flying directly toward a man in an impeccable white suit. The crimson liquid exploded across his chest like a violent abstract painting. The music screeched to a halt. Every head turned. Layla froze, her heart pounding in her ears as she stared at the man's thunderous expression. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he hissed, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "This suit costs more than you make in a year." The banker, Layla would later learn he was the CFO of one of the city's largest financial institutions, looked at her as if she were something unpleasant he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. But worse than his rage was the reaction of the surrounding guests. Laughter rippled through the crowd, not sympathetic chuckles or embarrassed titters, but cruel, mocking laughter directed squarely at Layla. A woman in a diamond necklace worth more than Layla's car whispered loudly to her companion, "This is why they should keep the help in the kitchen where they belong." Another man smirked, raising his champagne glass in a mock toast. "Quite the entrance. Perhaps she's auditioning for the circus." The room became a chorus of sneers and jabs, each comment driving home the same message: "You don't belong here. You are less than us. You are our entertainment." Layla's hands trembled as she fumbled for the napkins in her delivery bag. "I'm so sorry, sir. I'll pay for the cleaning." "I pay for it?" He laughed bitterly. "With what? Your tips from delivering noodles?" More laughter rippled through the room. Someone took a photo. Layla imagined it circulating on social media by morning, her humiliation immortalized for strangers to mock. Her grandmother's restaurant would lose this client. Maybe others too if word spread. The 5 jobs she worked would barely cover their rent, as it was. "Security!" the banker barked, gesturing toward Layla with disgust. "Remove this person." A large security guard materialized instantly, gripping Layla's arm with unnecessary force. The physical contact shocked her almost as much as the public ridicule. In 5 years of service work, she'd been invisible, ignored, overlooked, but never manhandled like property. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I still need to deliver the rest of the food. My grandmother's restaurant should hire competent staff," the banker finished, turning away dismissively. The security guard began dragging Layla toward the service elevator, his fingers digging into her arm, hard enough to leave bruises. The remaining food bags dropped to the floor. Tomorrow, she'd have to explain to her grandmother why their biggest catering client would never call again. She'd have to cover the cost of the wasted food from her already thin paycheck. The banker would return to his life of luxury without a second thought about the person whose livelihood he'd just threatened. That's enough. The voice cut through the murmurs and laughter like a blade. Deep, authoritative, undeniable. The crowd parted as a tall man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit approached. Unlike the others, he wasn't laughing. His expression was unreadable as he studied the scene before him. "Let her go," he said to the security guard, who immediately released Layla's arm. "Stone, this doesn't concern you," the banker said, his tone noticeably less confident. "This girl ruined my Brioni suit, and I'm sure your army of assistants will have it cleaned by morning, Harrison." The man called Stone turned to Layla, his gaze intense, but not unkind. "You work at Oriental Flavor on Mason Street, don't you?" Layla blinked in surprise. "Yes. How did you—" "The yakisoba noodles. Nobody makes them like you do." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "I order them at least twice a week." The crowd watched in stunned silence. Layla recognized him now. Richard Stone, CEO of Stone Enterprises, and reportedly worth billions. The wealthiest person in the room was defending her, the delivery girl, who'd just caused a scene. "Mr. Stone, she can't just—" the banker began, but Richard silenced him with a look. "Harrison, go get yourself cleaned up. The bar has club soda." He turned back to Layla. "What's your name?" "Layla," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard nodded thoughtfully. "Layla, how much does Oriental Flavor pay you?" The question caught her off guard. "Minimum wage plus tips." "Why?" "I've been looking for a personal chef, someone who can make authentic food, not the pretentious nonsense these caterers provide." He gestured around the room. "I'd like to offer you a job, 3 times what you're making now." The room fell silent. The banker's jaw dropped. Layla stood frozen, certain she'd misheard. "You want to hire me? After I just—" She gestured helplessly at the stained white suit. "Because of what just happened," Richard corrected. "Everyone else in this room," he glanced around with undisguised contempt, "would have groveled and begged for forgiveness. You immediately offered to make it right, despite knowing it would cost you. That kind of integrity is rare in my world." He pulled a business card from his pocket and pressed it into her hand. "Come to my office tomorrow at 9 a.m. We'll discuss details." As Richard turned away, the crowd began to whisper, but this time in awe rather than mockery. The security guard, who had grabbed Layla moments before, now stood respectfully aside. The banker slunk away toward the bar. His audience dispersed. Layla stared at the embossed card in her hand, trying to process what had just happened. Her worst professional nightmare, public humiliation in front of the elite, had somehow transformed into an opportunity beyond anything she could have imagined. The embossed business card trembled slightly in Layla's fingers as she stood surrounded by the elite of the city. Most delivery workers who accidentally spill drinks on banking executives don't receive job offers from billionaires. They receive pink slips. She glanced up at Richard Stone, whose tall frame and confident posture commanded the attention of everyone in the opulent room. The combined net worth surrounding her was staggering, and every expectation was that she would simply bow her head, murmur grateful thanks, and accept whatever was being offered to someone like her. "So what do you think?" Richard asked, his voice carrying across the now silent room. 3 times your current salary to be my personal chef. Your food is exceptional, and I want it available whenever I desire." The guests exchanged knowing smiles, clearly appreciating the charity case unfolding before them. A wealthy man extending a generous handout to someone who had just humiliated herself. The narrative was already writing itself in their minds. The gracious millionaire rescuing the clumsy service worker. But something unexpected flickered across Layla's face. Not gratitude, not relief, but calculation. "Mr. Stone," she began, her voice steadier than she felt, "I appreciate the offer, but I would need 5 times my current salary to consider leaving my grandmother's restaurant." The room froze. A champagne glass nearly slipped from someone's hand. A woman in diamonds audibly gasped. The audacity of this delivery girl to counteroffer was simply unheard of in their world. "Did she just?" whispered one guest to another. "Negotiate with Richard Stone," came the stunned reply. Richard's expression transformed from benevolent patron to curious businessman. For years, he had been surrounded by people who eagerly agreed with his every word, anticipated his desires before he voiced them, and never, ever challenged his first offer. Yet here stood this woman in food-stained clothes, setting an anchor point that would change the entire negotiation. 5 times? Richard repeated, a hint of amusement coloring his voice. That's quite ambitious for someone who was delivering food just 15 minutes ago. Layla held his gaze. My grandmother's restaurant will lose a major client because of today's incident. If I leave to work for you, that creates another hardship for her business. The compensation needs to reflect that reality. The wealthy onlookers shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't how these interactions were supposed to go. Service workers were meant to be grateful for whatever was offered, not apply negotiation tactics typically reserved for corporate boardrooms. Richard tilted his head, studying her with growing interest. Tell me, where did you learn to negotiate like this? When you're trying to keep a family restaurant afloat, you learn quickly how to talk to suppliers, landlords, and banks, Layla responded. 5 times my current wage would allow me to help my grandmother hire replacement help, while also compensating me fairly for my skills. The crowd watched in fascination as Richard's face registered something they rarely witnessed: genuine surprise. The dynamics in the room had shifted entirely. What began as an act of charity had transformed into a business negotiation between equals, despite the obvious gulf in their financial positions. 4 times, Richard countered, stepping closer to her, and that's already generous considering you have no formal culinary training. 4.5, Layla responded without hesitation, and I keep creative control over the menu. The onlookers were now completely captivated by the unfolding drama. An elderly gentleman in the back actually chuckled, the kind of appreciative laugh that acknowledged a skilled player at the table. Richard's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in assessment. The silence stretched between them as he considered the counteroffer. Everyone could see the calculations running behind his eyes, not just financial ones, but evaluations of character, potential, and spirit. You understand that most people in your position would simply say yes to whatever I offered, Richard finally said. I'm not most people, Mr. Stone, Layla replied quietly. And if you're hiring me for my cooking, you're not looking for most people either. A slow smile spread across Richard's face, the genuine kind that rarely appeared in these social settings. 4.5 times, he agreed, extending his hand, and creative control of the menu. The collective intake of breath from the watching crowd was audible. They had just witnessed something virtually unheard of in their circles. A service worker without connections, credentials, or capital had just successfully negotiated with one of the most powerful men in the city. Layla shook his hand firmly, her expression serious despite the victory. When do I start? Tomorrow? Richard replied. My assistant will send you the details tonight. As the crowd began to disperse, murmuring in fascination about what they'd just witnessed, Layla felt the weight of her decision settle on her shoulders. She had just committed to leaving the restaurant that had been her family's livelihood for generations. The place where she had grown up watching her grandmother transform simple ingredients into dishes that carried their cultural heritage forward. For the first time, the reality of her new path began to sink in. She wasn't just accepting a job, she was stepping into an entirely different world, one that operated by rules she was only beginning to understand. She would be cooking in gleaming kitchens with unlimited budgets, instead of the cramped, familiar space where her grandmother had taught her everything she knew. Richard observed her subtle shift in expression. Having second thoughts already? Just thinking about my grandmother, Layla admitted. The restaurant has been in our family for generations. Walking away from it, even for this opportunity. You're not walking away, Richard noted. You're creating a new path that might eventually help secure its future. Sometimes moving forward is the best way to preserve what matters. Layla nodded, surprised by his perception. Perhaps there was more to Richard Stone than his wealth and status suggested. As he guided her toward the exit, away from the still whispering crowd, she felt the weight of the business card in her hand. No longer just a piece of expensive paper, but a key to a door she never expected to walk through. The next morning, that door materialized as a towering glass structure that stretched toward the clouds. Stone Enterprises headquarters, where kitchens cost more than entire restaurants and reputations shattered faster than fine china. As Layla approached the revolving doors, her worn sneakers squeaked against the polished marble entrance. She clutched her small bag of personal knives, the only familiar things in this unfamiliar world. The security guard's skeptical glance spoke volumes. She clearly didn't look like she belonged here. "Layla Ramos for Mr. Stone," she stated, her voice steadier than her nerves. The guard's eyebrows raised slightly before he checked his tablet and reluctantly handed her a visitor badge. The elevator ride to the 70th floor penthouse felt like ascending to another dimension. Each floor marker that lit up increased the knot in Layla's stomach. The doors opened to reveal a sprawling open-concept space where floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the entire city like a living painting. The penthouse kitchen gleamed with state-of-the-art appliances she'd only seen in magazines, induction cooktops, blast chillers, and what appeared to be a sous vide station worth more than her grandmother's entire cooking equipment collection. "You must be the new chef," a voice startled her. A woman in a tailored suit appraised Layla with clinical efficiency. "Mr. Stone is in a meeting. You can familiarize yourself with the kitchen while you wait." Layla nodded, fighting the overwhelming sensation that she had stepped into a trap rather than an opportunity. The knife bag she carried suddenly felt inadequate next to the German steel collection displayed on a magnetic wall strip. She ran her fingers along the pristine countertops, feeling like an imposter in a world where even the refrigerator probably cost more than her annual rent. When Richard finally appeared an hour later, he carried none of the previous night's warmth. Here, surrounded by the trappings of his empire, he moved with the calculated precision of someone who controlled rooms rather than simply occupied them. "Layla, good. I'd like you to prepare something for lunch. Something simple, but representative of your skills." Her hands trembled slightly as she began working. The kitchen's unfamiliar layout had her opening multiple drawers just to find basic tools. She decided on her signature, yakisoba, the dish Richard had recognized her for, hoping that familiar flavors would ground her in this floating glass palace. As she worked, Layla became increasingly aware of eyes watching her every move. Richard observed from his desk across the open space, occasionally taking calls, but never fully shifting his attention. Two assistants whispered near the elevator, glancing her way with undisguised curiosity. The pressure of their collective gaze made her hands clumsy, her movements less fluid than usual. The critical mistake happened during the final seasoning. Distracted by a sudden burst of laughter from a group entering the penthouse, Layla added soy sauce without measuring. The dark liquid poured too generously into her carefully constructed dish. Her heart sank as she frantically attempted to rebalance the flavors, but the saltiness had already taken hold. "Is everything all right?" Richard appeared at her side, his presence intensifying her panic. "I'm sorry, I added too much soy sauce. I can start over," she offered, already reaching for fresh ingredients. "No need. Let me taste it as is." Richard took the chopsticks she offered and sampled the dish. His expression remained neutral as he chewed thoughtfully. Layla felt her new career evaporating before it had even begun. "It's indeed over-seasoned," he finally said, "but the underlying technique is excellent. The noodles have perfect texture. Try adding a touch of mirin and some fresh scallions to balance it." Layla blinked in surprise. In her grandmother's kitchen, mistakes were opportunities for learning, but she'd expected corporate America, especially at this level, to be mercilessly unforgiving. She quickly incorporated his suggestions, grateful for the second chance. As she plated the revised dish, the elevator doors opened again, revealing a slim man in an expensive tailored suit. He strode directly to Richard, barely acknowledging Layla's presence. "Richard, we need to discuss the Singapore acquisition before your 2 o'clock, he announced, before turning curious eyes toward Layla. "Who's this?" "Paul, meet Layla Ramos, my new personal chef." "Layla, this is Paul Westbrook, my financial advisor." Paul's eyes narrowed as he assessed her from head to toe. "A chef? I thought you were interviewing candidates from Le Cordon Bleu next week." "Change of plans," Richard replied casually, accepting the plate Layla offered. "Try this." Paul reluctantly took a small bite, his expression souring immediately. It's quite ethnic, isn't it? Seems rather simple for someone of your stature, Richard. The dismissal in his tone was unmistakable. Layla felt her cheeks burn with a mixture of embarrassment and indignation. Simple doesn't mean lacking in skill, Paul, Richard countered. This has more authentic flavor than half the Michelin-starred restaurants in this city. Paul smiled thinly. If you say so. But if she's truly talented, perhaps she should cook for tomorrow's business dinner with the Nakamura group. They're bringing their entire executive team, and impressing them is critical for the Tokyo expansion. The challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown at Layla's feet. Tomorrow? A business dinner for international executives? The stakes couldn't be higher for a first assignment. What do you think, Layla? Richard asked, seemingly genuinely interested in her response. I can do it, she answered, her voice finding its confidence despite the intimidating prospect. But I'd like to choose my own menu, Paul scoffed. A street cook planning a menu for a $60 million deal? Richard, you can't be serious. I believe that's exactly what makes her perspective valuable, Richard replied smoothly. The Nakamura Group has seen every pretentious corporate dinner imaginable. Something authentic might be refreshing. Layla stood straighter, emboldened by Richard's unexpected defense. I'll create a menu that honors traditional techniques while incorporating elements that will appeal to your guests. Settled then, Richard nodded, turning back to Paul. Now, about Singapore. As the men moved to Richard's office area, Layla began mentally planning her menu. This dinner would either cement her position or confirm Paul's dismissive judgment. The weight of tomorrow's expectations pressed down on her shoulders, but rather than feeling crushed, she felt determined. Later, as she prepared to leave for the day, Richard approached her again. Don't let Paul intimidate you, he said quietly. He measures worth by degrees and pedigrees. I measure it by results, Layla replied. Tomorrow's dinner will speak for itself. Richard smiled, the first genuine expression she'd seen from him all day. I'm counting on it. The ingredients you request will be here in the morning. As Layla descended in the elevator, the reality of her situation crystallized. She had less than 24 hours to prove herself in a world designed to make people like her fail. But as the glass tower receded behind her, one thought burned brighter than her anxiety. She would approach tomorrow on her own terms, cooking food that reflected her heritage and skills, not what Paul or anyone else expected from her. In the culinary world, there's a strange paradox that elite diners rarely experience. Sometimes the most powerful flavors come from the simplest kitchens. As the hour of judgment approached, Layla wasn't just preparing dinner. She was challenging an entire system that determined whose food deserved respect. Standing in that gleaming penthouse kitchen, surrounded by equipment that cost more than her grandmother's entire restaurant, she arranged her modest ingredients with steady hands that belied her racing heart. The Nakamura executives would be arriving any minute. These weren't just any businessmen. They were the gatekeepers to a $60 million deal and accustomed to being wooed with elaborate culinary spectacles. Instead, they would find shrimp fritters, special fried rice, sweet and sour beef, and yakisoba, street food elevated through skill rather than pretension. Are you sure about this menu? Paul appeared in the doorway, his voice dripping with thinly veiled contempt. These people expect a certain caliber of dining experience. The emphasis on caliber made it clear exactly what he thought of Layla's choices. I'm cooking what I know, Layla replied without looking up from the ginger she was julienning with practiced precision. Food that has actual flavor. Paul's chuckle was cold as the imported marble countertops. Well, I suppose Richard can always order in from L'Argent if this experiment fails. Just try not to embarrass him completely. As Paul's footsteps retreated, Layla caught her reflection in a polished copper pan. She looked different somehow, still herself, but standing straighter, her chin held higher. The woman staring back at her didn't look intimidated. She looked ready. The dining room hummed with the careful conversation of powerful men sizing each other up. Through the kitchen's small viewing window, Layla watched as Richard guided the Japanese executives to their seats with the smooth confidence that came naturally to someone who had never questioned his place at such tables. In contrast, Paul hovered like a vulture, anticipating a kill, occasionally shooting glances toward the kitchen that made his expectations of failure abundantly clear. First course, Layla announced to the kitchen staff. All professionals who had initially regarded her with skepticism, but now moved with the synchronized precision of those who recognized competence when they saw it. As the shrimp fritters were placed before each guest, Layla registered the flicker of disappointment crossing several faces. One executive actually frowned, looking around as if expecting servers to arrive with the really first course. Richard maintained his pleasant expression, though she could see a momentary flash of uncertainty in his eyes. "Please enjoy," Richard said, gesturing toward the plates. "This is a specialty from Chef Layla's family restaurant." The skepticism was palpable as forks hesitantly approached the golden brown morsels. Layla held her breath. These weren't just bites of food. They were her entire world, her heritage, her skill, condensed into a single mouthful. The Japanese CFO was the first to take a bite. His face remained perfectly composed, giving away nothing. Then came the CEO, followed by their legal counsel. Silence filled the room like a physical presence. From her vantage point, Layla couldn't see their expressions clearly, but the rigid set of Paul's shoulders told her everything she needed to know about his anticipation of her impending failure. And then something shifted. The CFO took another bite, then another. The CEO leaned over and whispered something to his colleague, who nodded in response. The legal counsel reached for his water, but Layla noticed his plate was already half empty. "This is," the CEO began, pausing as if searching for the right word. Every muscle in Layla's body tensed. "Exceptional. There's a complexity here I wasn't expecting." Paul's head snapped up, his smug smile faltering for the first time. The outer crispness, giving way to that soft interior, reminds me of the street food near our Tokyo headquarters, but with distinct regional influences I can't quite place, the CFO added, closely examining the remaining portion on his fork. Richard's shoulders visibly relaxed as he smiled. "Chef Layla brings a unique perspective to her cooking. I'm glad you appreciate it." The rest of the meal unfolded like a symphony building to its crescendo. Each course was met first with surprise, then appreciation, then outright enthusiasm. The special fried rice prompted discussions of texture and balance. The sweet and sour beef elicited stories of favorite food discoveries during business travels. Paul's contributions to the conversation grew increasingly sparse as his predicted disaster transformed into an undeniable triumph. But it was the yakisoba that truly silenced the room. As the signature dish was placed before the guests, Layla finally emerged from the kitchen to personally present her creation. The simple noodle dish steamed invitingly, garnished not with gold leaf or exotic flowers, but with perfectly arranged vegetables and a sauce that gleamed with promise. "This is my grandmother's recipe," she explained, consciously pushing aside the nervous tremor that threatened her voice. "She taught me that good food doesn't need to hide behind expensive ingredients or elaborate presentations. It just needs to tell a truth about who we are and where we come from." The Nakamura CEO closed his eyes as he took his first bite. For a terrifying moment, Layla thought she'd made a terrible mistake. Then his expression transformed into something rarely seen in high-stakes business dinners: genuine delight. "Ms. Layla," he said, setting down his fork with deliberate care, "in our business travels, we are served impressive food nearly every night. Foams, rare ingredients, dishes that cost more than most people's monthly salary. But this," he gestured to his plate, "this has something no amount of money can buy: authenticity." The table erupted into appreciative murmurs as the other executives nodded in agreement. In the corner, Paul's face had taken on the sickly pallor of someone watching their carefully orchestrated plan collapse in real time. "The balance of flavors is extraordinary," added the legal counsel, a man who had barely spoken the entire evening. "There's an honesty to this cooking that's refreshing." As the meal concluded and the executives filed out with handshakes and business cards exchanged, Layla noticed Richard lingering behind. The deal was secured. That much was clear from the easy smiles and promises of follow-up meetings. But something more significant had happened tonight. "You know," Richard said quietly as they stood alone in the dining room, "Paul was convinced you would crash and burn tonight. He actually suggested I have a backup catering service on standby." Layla allowed herself a small smile. "And did you?" "No," Richard replied, his eyes meeting hers with new respect. I had a feeling you might surprise them, though I admit, I didn't expect you to completely win them over. The Nakamura group is notoriously difficult to impress. People often confuse expensive with good, Layla said, gathering empty plates with the ingrained habit of someone who had worked in restaurants her entire life. But at the end of the day, food should make you feel something real. Later that night, as the kitchen staff finished cleaning, Paul appeared in the doorway one final time. His earlier smugness had been replaced by something closer to calculating reassessment. "Well played," he said stiffly, "but don't get too comfortable. One dinner doesn't make you indispensable." Layla met his gaze evenly. "No, it doesn't, but it's a start. Victory tastes sweet until someone decides to poison the well." As Layla savored her triumph after impressing the Nakamura executives, a new threat was already materializing, one that had nothing to do with cooking skills and everything to do with status and possession. The kitchen battle was won, but a far more treacherous war was about to begin. 3 days after the successful business dinner, Layla was preparing Richard's lunch when the elevator doors to the penthouse slid open. The sharp, rhythmic click of designer heels against marble announced a visitor who moved through the world, expecting it to part for her. Miranda Ashford strode into the penthouse kitchen like she owned it, or more accurately, like she owned the man who owned it. "Richard, darling." Her voice carried the polished inflection of someone who had attended the finest schools and collected prestigious surnames, like others collected souvenirs. "I've been calling you all week." Layla glanced up from the ginger she was mincing to see a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a high-fashion magazine. Miranda stood tall in a cream-colored Chanel suit that probably cost more than 6 months of Layla's new salary. Her chestnut hair fell in perfect waves around a face that had never known hardship, framing features that were currently arranged in an expression of practiced delight. Richard emerged from his home office, his surprise evident. "Miranda, this is unexpected." "The best things usually are," Miranda purred, air-kissing both his cheeks before her gaze finally landed on Layla. Her smile didn't falter, but something in her eyes hardened like ice forming over a deep pond. "And who might this be?" "This is Layla, my personal chef," Richard explained, his tone neutral but firm. Miranda's eyebrows arched slightly. "A chef? How quaint. I thought you were still using that catering service." She turned to Layla with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Would you be a dear and fix us some coffee? I take mine with a splash of almond milk, unsweetened, of course." The request hung in the air, dripping with the casual entitlement of someone accustomed to being served. Not a request at all, but a command disguised as politeness. "I'm currently preparing Mr. Stone's lunch," Layla replied evenly, refusing to break eye contact. "But the coffee machine is just behind you, if you'd like to help yourself." A moment of tension crystallized between them. Miranda's smile froze, like a predator reassessing its approach. "I see Richard's staff has become rather informal in my absence," Miranda remarked, turning back to Richard with an indulgent laugh. She placed a manicured hand on his arm, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light. "Remember when we had that lovely household manager? What was her name? Greta?" She understood proper service. Richard gently disengaged himself from her touch. "Layla isn't household staff, Miranda. She's a culinary professional who's been revolutionizing my dining experience." Miranda's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "How fascinating. I didn't realize your palate had become so adventurous." The conversation continued with Miranda strategically positioning herself between Richard and the kitchen, effectively cutting Layla out of the exchange. She reminisced about their shared past, dropping names of exclusive restaurants and private clubs they had frequented together. Each reference was a subtle reminder of the world they shared, a world where Layla was merely a visitor. "Speaking of dining," Miranda said, her voice lifting with manufactured enthusiasm, "I've secured a table at LeBlanc for Friday evening. Pierre himself promised to prepare his famous truffle soufflé for us. You remember how we adored it in Paris?" LeBlanc was notoriously exclusive, with a waiting list that stretched months for ordinary mortals. The implication was clear. Miranda still had access to realms Layla could only glimpse from the outside. "That's thoughtful, Miranda, but," Richard began. "I've already been planning Richard's meals for the week," Layla interjected, finding her voice. Including a special dinner for Friday. Something I think he'll enjoy more than anything on LeBlanc's menu. Miranda turned slowly, as if surprised that kitchen furniture had suddenly developed the ability to speak. How sweet, but LeBlanc has 3 Michelin stars. I doubt anything prepared in a penthouse kitchen could quite compare, no matter how enthusiastic the effort. The condescension in her voice was thick enough to cut with one of Layla's knives. But instead of retreating, Layla felt a surprising calm wash over her. This woman, with all her polish and pedigree, was threatened by her. The realization was both absurd and empowering. Michelin stars are impressive, Layla acknowledged, continuing to prepare the meal with steady hands. But they often reward technique over soul. I'd put my grandmother's recipes against any restaurant's menu for one simple reason. They're made with intention, not pretension. Miranda's laugh tinkled like expensive crystal. How charmingly provincial. Richard, your chef has quite the spirited perspective. Perhaps she doesn't realize that LeBlanc's executive chef trained under Alain Ducasse, and I trained under my grandmother, who fed 3 generations with nothing but instinct and love for her craft, Layla countered. Different educations, but both valid. Richard watched this exchange with growing interest, his eyes moving between the 2 women. Actually, I'd prefer to try Layla's special dinner on Friday, he said finally. Miranda, perhaps we can reschedule LeBlanc for another time. The shift in the atmosphere was immediate. Miranda's perfectly composed facade cracked just enough to reveal the fury beneath. She recovered quickly, but not before Layla caught a glimpse of what truly lurked behind the designer clothes and cultivated mannerisms. Raw jealousy. Of course, darling, if you'd prefer home cooking to a world-class culinary experience, who am I to argue? Miranda's smile was brittle now, though I can't help but wonder what makes this chef's food so irresistible. The insinuation hung in the air, pointed and deliberate. It's authentic, Richard said simply, something increasingly rare in my world. For the first time, Miranda seemed genuinely caught off guard. Her gaze hardened as she looked at Layla with new assessment, no longer seeing a servant, but a rival. Well, I should be going. Meetings all afternoon. She kissed Richard's cheek, lingering a moment too long. Don't be a stranger, darling. Your world misses you. As Miranda clicked her way back to the elevator, she paused and turned to Layla. I do hope your little dinner is a success. It's so important for staff to feel valued. Her smile was a masterpiece of false warmth. Although, in my experience, men like Richard eventually tire of novelty and return to what's familiar, especially when the novelty doesn't quite fit their lifestyle. After Miranda's departure, a heavy silence filled the penthouse. Layla returned to her cooking, aware that something fundamental had shifted. I apologize for Miranda, Richard said finally. She can be territorial, Layla supplied, a slight smile playing on her lips. Richard laughed, the tension breaking. An accurate assessment. She's having trouble accepting that we're no longer together. I gathered that, Layla said dryly. I also gathered she sees me as a threat, which is ridiculous, considering I'm just your chef. Richard studied her for a long moment. I don't think she finds it ridiculous at all. Their eyes met briefly, and something unspoken passed between them before Layla looked away, focusing intently on plating Richard's lunch. That unspoken moment between Richard and Layla lingered in the air long after lunch was served, quietly transforming into something neither of them had anticipated. What happens when a billionaire who can buy anything offers a partnership instead of a paycheck? The answer would rewrite both their futures in ways neither could imagine. Richard waited until Layla had finished clearing the dishes before dropping a proposal that would change everything. I've been thinking, he began, his voice unusually hesitant for a man who commanded boardrooms with unwavering confidence. Your cooking isn't just good, Layla. It's exceptional. The way you connected with the Nakamura executives through food was something I've never seen before. Layla wiped her hands on her apron, unsure where this conversation was heading. Thank you, but I was just cooking the way my grandmother taught me. That's exactly it. Richard leaned forward, his eyes alive with an excitement Layla hadn't seen before. What if we opened a restaurant together, not as employer and employee, but as business partners? Layla froze, certain she had misheard. A restaurant? With me as your partner? The words felt foreign on her tongue, impossible to reconcile with her reality. Just weeks ago, she had been juggling multiple jobs to support her grandmother's struggling business. "I'm serious," Richard continued, unfolding a small map of the city. "I've been looking at locations, and I found this space." He pointed to an area not in the glittering downtown district, where most upscale restaurants clustered, but closer to Layla's community. "It's 15 minutes from your village. I thought it would be important to you to remain connected to your roots." The thoughtfulness of this gesture stunned Layla more than the proposal itself. She had expected that if Richard ever ventured into the restaurant business, he would choose a location designed to attract the wealthy elite he normally associated with. "But why would you want me as a partner? I don't have money to invest. I don't have connections or business experience, or..." "You have something far more valuable," Richard interrupted. "You have talent that can't be taught, and an understanding of food that connects with people on a deeper level. The Nakamura executives didn't just enjoy your meal, they experienced it. That's worth more than any financial investment." Layla's mind raced with conflicting emotions. The opportunity was beyond anything she could have dreamed of, but her grandmother's restaurant had been the center of her life for as long as she could remember. The thought of leaving it behind felt like a betrayal of her family legacy. "I don't know if I can leave my grandmother's restaurant," she admitted. "It's been in our family for generations." "Talk to her," Richard suggested gently. "This partnership would mean you could support her business in ways you never could before. And your community would benefit too. We'd hire locally, source ingredients from nearby farms." That night, Layla sat at her grandmother's kitchen table, the familiar sounds and smells of the small restaurant surrounding them, as she explained Richard's proposal. She expected resistance, perhaps even disappointment. Instead, her grandmother's weathered face broke into a wide smile. "Layla," she said, taking her granddaughter's hands in her own, "restaurants are not meant to be chains that bind us to the past. They are places where we create new stories." She gestured around the modest space. "I never wanted this place to be your prison. It was always meant to be your foundation." Tears welled in Layla's eyes. "But what about our family traditions? The recipes passed down for generations. Those recipes live in your hands now, not in these walls," her grandmother replied wisely. "They will travel wherever you go, and perhaps in this new place, more people will come to appreciate them. Isn't that what our family has always wanted? For our food to bring joy to as many people as possible." With her grandmother's blessing, Layla returned to Richard the next day, ready to discuss the partnership in earnest. Over the following weeks, they spent countless hours planning every detail of their restaurant. Their debates were passionate but productive, Richard bringing his business acumen and resources, Layla contributing her culinary expertise and deep understanding of authentic, accessible food. "What about the name?" Richard asked one afternoon, as they reviewed architectural plans. "I was thinking something like Stone and Layla's, or perhaps something more upscale, like Artisanal Heritage." Layla shook her head. "Those names don't capture what makes our restaurant special. It's not about us as individuals or trying to sound fancy." She thought for a moment. "What about Flavors of the Village?" Richard tested the name aloud. "Flavors of the Village. I like it. It honors your community, while suggesting something authentic and approachable." "Exactly," Layla nodded. "It represents both our worlds coming together. Your business vision helping to showcase the culinary traditions I grew up with." As they finalized their business plan, Layla made her non-negotiable points clear. "I need equal decision-making power, especially regarding the menu and pricing. I won't create a restaurant that the people from my community can't afford to eat at." Richard studied her for a moment, respect evident in his expression. "You know, most people in your position would just be grateful for the opportunity and agree to whatever terms I set." "I'm grateful for the opportunity," Layla acknowledged, "but not at the expense of my values. This restaurant should be accessible to everyone, not just those who can afford to pay premium prices for exotic experiences." Instead of pushback, Richard smiled. "That's why I want you as my partner, Layla. You see things differently. Your perspective is exactly what will make this restaurant stand out." Their business model took shape around this core philosophy, creating a restaurant that would serve high-quality, authentic food at prices that wouldn't exclude the very community that inspired the cuisine. They would prioritize local hiring and source ingredients from nearby suppliers whenever possible, creating a business that lifted up the entire neighborhood rather than just profiting from it. When the contract was finally ready, Layla arrived at Stone Enterprises with a mixture of nervousness and determination. The document before her would transform her from an employee to a business owner, from someone who delivered food to someone who created culinary experiences. As she reviewed the terms with Richard, she was relieved to see that every promise had been kept: equal partnership, shared decision-making, and a commitment to community-focused practices. The contract specified that profits would be fairly split, with a percentage dedicated to community initiatives and local supplier development. Richard had even included a clause ensuring that a portion of the restaurant's seats would always be reserved for local residents, regardless of how popular or in demand the establishment might become. Layla's hand trembled slightly as she signed her name. From delivery girl to restaurant co-owner with a billionaire, the trajectory seemed impossible, yet here she was. As Richard added his signature beside hers, their eyes met across the table. "Well, partner," he said with a genuine smile that transformed his usually serious face. "Ready to create something remarkable together?" With a handshake that sealed their partnership, neither Richard nor Layla could have predicted the storm brewing on the horizon. Their restaurant, Flavors of the Village, had become an overnight sensation, with lines stretching around the block and reservations booked weeks in advance. The unique blend of Layla's authentic cooking and Richard's business acumen had created something magical, a place where both villagers and city elites could enjoy exceptional food at reasonable prices. But success breeds enemies, and Miranda had been watching from the shadows, her jealousy festering with each glowing review and packed dining room. The morning started like any other. Layla arrived at the restaurant before dawn to prep the day's specialties when her phone exploded with notifications. One glance at the screen made her blood run cold. Health department shuts down. Celebrity restaurant, amid serious violations, screamed the headline from the city's most prominent news outlet. Below it was a photo of their restaurant, with an official closure notice plastered across the door, a door she was standing just feet away from, with no such notice in sight. "Richard," she gasped into the phone, her voice trembling. "Something's happened." Within 30 minutes, Richard's sleek black car screeched to a halt outside. His normally composed face was tight with fury as he examined the fabricated news story on his tablet. By then, their phones were ringing non-stop. Suppliers, customers, investors, all demanding explanations about violations that had never occurred. "This is impossible," Richard muttered, pacing the immaculate kitchen. "We had an inspection just 2 weeks ago. We passed with flying colors." The true scope of the sabotage became clear when health inspectors arrived later that morning, grim-faced and apologetic. Someone had filed an anonymous complaint with doctored photographs showing expired products in their storage and roaches in food preparation areas. The photos were convincing enough that the department had no choice but to investigate. "Even though we can see your facility is spotless," the lead inspector explained, "protocol requires us to close you down pending a full investigation. The process typically takes 2 weeks at minimum." 2 weeks. In the restaurant business, it might as well be a death sentence. As the inspectors left, Layla spotted a familiar cream-colored luxury car parked across the street, and through the tinted windows, she caught a glimpse of Miranda's satisfied smile before the vehicle pulled away. "It's her," Layla said, her voice hollow. "She's behind this." Richard's jaw tightened. "I know," he replied, "but proving it won't reopen our doors today." The devastating impact was immediate. Their phones buzzed constantly with cancellation notifications. Social media exploded with speculation. Former patrons publicly questioned whether they'd gotten sick from previous meals. The restaurant's perfect 5-star rating plummeted as 1-star reviews flooded in from accounts that had never dined there. That evening, sitting in the darkened dining room, Layla and Richard faced the grim financial reality. Each day closed meant thousands in lost revenue, while expenses, rent, salaries, perishable inventory, continued to mount. Their staff gathered around them, faces drawn with worry about lost wages and uncertain futures. 2 weeks could kill us, Richard admitted, running calculations on his tablet. Even with my resources, the reputational damage might be irreparable. The room fell silent. Then Layla looked up, her eyes suddenly bright with an idea. If people can't come to our food, she began slowly, then we bring our food to the people. The pivot happened with remarkable speed. By midnight, Layla had redesigned their menu for travel-friendly dishes. Richard repurposed their website for online ordering. By dawn, they'd converted their dining room into a delivery command center, with tables now serving as packaging stations. "But who will deliver the food?" one of the line cooks asked. Richard smiled for the first time that day. "I have an idea." That afternoon, social media buzzed with photos of Richard Stone, billionaire CEO, personally delivering food orders throughout the city, dressed in a simple, Flavors of the Village t-shirt. The sight of the famous businessman carrying delivery bags to doorsteps created an immediate sensation. If a health violation had actually occurred, would the owner himself be handling your food? Richard asked reporters who swarmed him. "This is a targeted attack, and rather than just fight it, we're adapting. Try our food and judge for yourselves." The strategy worked brilliantly. Orders began flooding in, first from curiosity seekers, then from loyal customers showing solidarity. Their kitchen, designed to serve seated diners, strained under the volume of delivery requests. Layla worked tirelessly, training staff to package dishes to maintain quality during transit. The psychological impact of false accusations can be devastating for business owners, Richard explained, during an impromptu interview outside a customer's home. But we refuse to let this fabricated scandal define us. By the end of the first week, they had hired 20 additional staff just to handle deliveries. Their improvised business model was not merely surviving, it was thriving. Customers posted supportive messages online, many openly questioning the timing and validity of the health department claims. "I've ordered from them 3 times this week," wrote one influential food blogger. "If there were actual health issues, I'd be in the hospital by now. Something doesn't add up here." The most moving support came from villagers near Layla's grandmother's home, who organized carpools to pick up large group orders directly from the restaurant's back door, circumventing the closed dining room entirely. One evening, as they were closing up after another exhausting but successful day, Layla found Richard staring at the locked front doors, deep in thought. "We're going to survive this," she said, placing a hand on his arm. "I know," he replied, "but surviving isn't enough. Not anymore." He turned to face her, his expression hardening with resolve. "Miranda crossed a line. She tried to destroy something we built together. I won't let that stand." "What are you thinking?" Layla asked, recognizing the determined look in his eyes. "I think it's time we fight back. Not just to reopen, but to expose exactly who's behind this." Richard pulled out his phone and scrolled to a contact. "Samuel is the best private investigator in the city. If there's evidence connecting Miranda to this sabotage, he'll find it." The call lasted less than 2 minutes. By morning, the investigation was underway, digging into Miranda's recent activities, financial transactions, and connections to the health department. Meanwhile, their delivery service continued to expand. Layla created special survival packages, family-sized portions of their most popular dishes, with handwritten thank you notes included in each order. The personal touch resonated with customers, many of whom posted photos of the notes on social media with hashtags like #StandWithFlavors and We Know the Truth. "Our restaurant may be temporarily closed," Layla told a reporter who came to cover their pivot strategy, "but our kitchen and our spirits remain very much open." The customer loyalty throughout the crisis proved remarkable. Regular patrons not only continued ordering but increased their frequency, some placing delivery orders 3 or 4 times weekly in deliberate shows of support. The restaurant's new delivery-focused business model was generating revenue that nearly matched their previous dine-in figures, an almost unheard-of achievement during a public health scandal. "When you build something authentic, people stand by you in hard times," Richard observed as they reviewed the day's sales. "They're not just customers anymore. They're advocates." As the 2-week investigation period neared its end, Richard received a call from Samuel, The private investigator had uncovered compelling evidence: bank transfers, text messages, and testimony from a health department clerk who'd been pressured to expedite the complaint. The pieces were falling into place, creating a clear picture of Miranda's elaborate sabotage scheme. Samuel's voice cracked through the phone with a revelation that changed everything. "There's someone on your staff who's been feeding Miranda information since day one." The investigator's words hung in the air as Richard and Layla exchanged looks of disbelief. While they had suspected Miranda's involvement in their restaurant's closure, the idea of an insider betrayal struck deeper than either had anticipated. "Who?" Richard demanded, his knuckles white around the phone. "The new hostess, Valerie. She was strategically planted 3 weeks before the health department showed up. I've been tracking her financial records. She receives consistent payments from a shell company that traces back to Miranda." Layla sank into a chair, the realization washing over her. She always volunteered to close up. She had access to everything. Richard paced the office while Samuel explained their options. Unlike other cases of corporate sabotage where evidence was circumstantial, they had what Samuel called the smoking gun, hard proof linking Miranda directly to their troubles. Bank records showed substantial transfers from Miranda's account to the shell company, which then paid Valerie and, more damning, a mid-level health department official. "We need to catch her in the act," Richard decided, formulating a plan that would leave no room for Miranda to wiggle out of responsibility. The next evening, they orchestrated a carefully planned trap. Richard deliberately left falsified confidential notes about violations they'd supposedly covered up, where Valerie would find them during her closing duties. They watched through hidden cameras as she methodically photographed the documents, unaware that she was being recorded. When Valerie finished her shift, Richard and Layla were waiting in the parking lot with Samuel. The confrontation was brief, but effective. "Looking for these?" Richard held up copies of the documents she'd photographed. "We know about Miranda, Valerie. We know about the payments." The color drained from Valerie's face. Unlike Miranda, she had no wealth or connections to shield her from the consequences of corporate espionage. Faced with the evidence, she crumbled quickly. "Miranda approached me at a bar, said she'd pay me double what you were offering, just to report back on things and occasionally plant items for health inspections." Valerie's voice trembled. "I didn't think anyone would get hurt. It was just a restaurant rivalry. Tell that to our staff who lost wages. Tell that to our customers who were lied to," Layla replied, her voice steady but fierce. Valerie's confession was comprehensive and legally documented by Samuel. She detailed how Miranda had orchestrated everything, from bribing the health inspector to timing the discovery of expired products that Miranda herself had supplied through Valerie. The confession was crucial, but it represented only the first step in their counterattack. Rather than confronting Miranda directly, Richard opted for a more strategic approach. In whistleblower cases in the restaurant industry, those who expose unethical practices often face significant risks, he explained, citing what their legal team had advised. Going directly to Miranda gives her time to destroy evidence and craft a narrative. "We need to ensure the truth comes out in a way she can't control." They compiled their evidence meticulously: bank records, text messages, Valerie's sworn statement, and testimony from the health department clerk who'd been pressured to expedite the complaint. The legal team prepared documents challenging the fraudulent health inspection, following the proper appeals process that included documentation of their previous compliance record and supporting evidence from regular customers. The next phase required careful timing. Richard leaked selected pieces of evidence to a respected business journalist known for investigative reporting. The story broke spectacularly. Restaurant sabotage, corporate heir apparent caught in scheme to destroy competitor. The article detailed Miranda's elaborate plot with supporting evidence that left little room for doubt. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Miranda's reputation in business circles plummeted as the story spread. Attempting damage control, she issued a poorly conceived statement claiming she was being framed, which only fueled further scrutiny. With public attention focused on the case, the health department had no choice but to convene an emergency hearing. Richard and Layla arrived with their legal team and complete documentation. The health department officials, now under intense scrutiny themselves for their role in the false claims, reviewed the evidence in stunned silence. "This represents a catastrophic failure of our regulatory process," admitted the department director after examining the records. "It appears our trust was exploited through manipulation and bribery." The decision came swiftly. All violations were expunged from the restaurant's record. Permits were reinstated immediately, and a formal public apology would be issued by the department. The official who had accepted bribes was placed on administrative leave pending criminal investigation. For Miranda, the consequences were severe. Her business connections distanced themselves rapidly, unwilling to be associated with such a scandal. Several companies where she held board positions requested her resignation. The legal ramifications were just beginning, with potential charges for corporate espionage, bribery of government officials, and defamation. When Flavors of the Village reopened, the response exceeded all expectations. The line of customers stretched for 3 blocks, many holding homemade signs supporting the restaurant. Local news crews captured the scene as Richard and Layla greeted each patron personally. "This is about more than just our business," Layla told reporters. "It's about standing up to powerful people who think they can crush smaller competitors through underhanded tactics." The experience transformed their business in unexpected ways. Studies have shown that businesses that successfully navigate public vindication after false accusation often experience increased customer loyalty. And Flavors of the Village proved this statistic correct. Their delivery service, born out of necessity during the closure, became a permanent and profitable aspect of their business model. They implemented a transparency initiative, inviting customers to tour the kitchen and observe their food safety practices. Each table featured a QR code linking to their public health inspection reports and food sourcing information. What Miranda had intended as destruction had inadvertently created a stronger, more resilient business with an even more loyal customer base. One evening, as they finally had a moment to reflect, Richard studied Layla across their office. "You know, when most people face this kind of attack from someone with Miranda's connections, they fold. You never even considered that option." Layla smiled, thinking about how far she'd come from delivering food to becoming a business owner who had successfully fought back against corporate sabotage. "When you grow up with nothing, you learn that sometimes fighting is your only option. I wasn't going to let her take something we built honestly." Richard nodded, a new respect in his eyes that went beyond admiration for her cooking abilities. There was something about the way they'd faced this crisis together that had subtly shifted their relationship. The line between business partners and something more personal had begun to blur in ways neither had fully acknowledged. That unacknowledged shift between them hung in the air like a whispered secret, waiting for someone brave enough to name it. For days after their victory against Miranda, Richard and Layla had been navigating this new, undefined territory between business partnership and something deeper. The restaurant crisis had bound them together in ways neither had anticipated, forging a connection that transcended their professional arrangement. "I'd like to take you to dinner," Richard said one evening, as they finalized the last details of their restaurant reopening. His voice carried a different weight than usual, less commanding CEO, more uncertain man. "Not to discuss business, just dinner." Layla looked up from her notebook, momentarily caught off guard. This wasn't in their carefully defined partnership agreement. "Dinner?" she repeated, as if the word itself required translation. "Yes, dinner. That thing where people sit across from each other and eat food while having conversations that don't involve profit margins or health inspectors," Richard replied, with a hint of that rarely seen playfulness. The restaurant he chose was the Sapphire Room, exclusive but not ostentatious, with a private dining area that offered stunning city views. As their car pulled up to the entrance, Layla felt a flutter of anxiety. This was different from their working dinners at the restaurant kitchen or late-night strategy sessions. This was Richard's world, a world where she had always been the person delivering the food, never the one being escorted to a table. What neither of them anticipated was the flash of cameras as they stepped out of the car. Several photographers had stationed themselves near the entrance, their cameras immediately capturing the moment when Richard placed his hand gently on the small of Layla's back to guide her inside. "Mr. Stone, is this a date? Who's the woman?" a photographer called out, the barrage of questions continuing as the maitre d' hurried them inside. "I'm sorry about that," Richard apologized once they were seated in the privacy of their secluded table. "I should have anticipated they might be there." Layla's hands trembled slightly as she unfolded her napkin. "Do they follow you everywhere?" "Not usually, but after the Miranda story broke," he shrugged. "You become more interesting when there's controversy." Their dinner conversation flowed with surprising ease, moving beyond the restaurant and into territories they'd never explored. Childhood memories, dreams deferred, books that had shaped their perspectives. For hours, the wealth gap between them seemed to disappear, revealing how similar they were in ways that truly mattered. But the real impact of the evening didn't register until Layla checked her phone the next morning and found dozens of messages from friends and family. The top headline on several news sites read, "CEO Richard Stone caught on romantic dinner with village girl." The photos showed them laughing, leaning toward each other, in conversation. And that moment, when Richard had guided her inside with his hand on her back, a gesture that appeared far more intimate in the frozen frame of a photograph. Panic seized Layla as she scrolled through the coverage. One article speculated about her rags-to-riches story. Another questioned if she had set her sights on capturing one of the city's most eligible bachelors. She dropped her phone as if it had burned her. This wasn't what she had signed up for. She was a chef, a business partner, not tabloid fodder for the entertainment of strangers. When Richard called, she could barely form coherent sentences. "Everyone's talking about it. They're analyzing what I was wearing. Richard, someone found pictures of me making deliveries from last year and posted them next to last night's photos, like some twisted before and after. I know, and I'm sorry." Richard's voice was steady, grounding. "But, Layla, I need to tell you something, and I probably should have said it before the cameras caught us having dinner." She held her breath, waiting. "I like you, Layla." 3 simple words, delivered without flourish or elaborate declarations. Yet they hit her with more force than any headline. "I like the way you stood your ground when we first met. I like how you cook with your whole heart. I like how you refuse to compromise on our restaurant's values. And I like that you still see me as just Richard, not a billionaire CEO." Layla's mind raced through a tornado of conflicting emotions. The media attention terrified her. The idea of being scrutinized, of becoming a character in some public narrative about the billionaire and the cook. But Richard's words struck at something deeper, a feeling she'd been carefully avoiding acknowledging. "I need time to think," was all she could manage before ending the call. That night became the longest of Layla's life. Sleep refused to come as she wrestled with the reality of what was happening. Her growing feelings for Richard were undeniable, but so was her fear of losing herself in his world. She'd worked too hard to establish her identity, to make her grandmother's recipes respected on their own merit. Would becoming Richard Stone's girlfriend overshadow everything else she was? Would the authenticity she'd fought to maintain be crushed under the weight of luxury and privilege? Most terrifying was the prospect of failure. Relationships across such vast socio-economic divides rarely survived the pressures from both worlds. The cruel headlines were just the beginning. How long before the whispers started that she was a gold digger, that he would eventually tire of his exotic village girl experiment? 2 more days passed with minimal contact between them, each message carefully professional. The tension was palpable when they found themselves together at the restaurant, both of them avoiding the elephant in the room with painful precision. It was Richard who finally broke the stalemate, asking Layla to meet him at the Grand Imperial Hotel, neutral territory, a place neither of them considered their domain. They met in a quiet corner of the garden terrace, away from curious eyes and potential cameras. "I've been thinking about what you might be afraid of," Richard began without preamble. "That entering my world would mean losing yourself, that people would see you differently, that we come from places too far apart to bridge." Layla looked at him, surprised by his insight. "But, Layla, we've already been bridging those worlds for months. We created a restaurant that brings your grandmother's recipes to people who'd never visit your village. We built a delivery service that takes that food into homes across the city. Every day, We prove that different worlds can not only connect, but create something beautiful together. He reached across the table, his hands stopping just short of hers. I want you to be with me, not as my chef or my business partner, though you're brilliant at both, but as yourself, just Layla, the woman who challenged me, surprised me, and made me see my own world differently. For a long moment, Layla sat silent, feeling the weight of this crossroads. Then slowly, deliberately, she closed the distance between their hands, placing hers in his. I'm afraid, she admitted. I'm afraid of the cameras and the headlines. I'm afraid people will never see me for me again. I'm afraid we'll try to merge our worlds and discover it can't be done. I'm afraid too, Richard confessed, the vulnerability in his voice more powerful than any business strategy he'd ever shared with her. I'm afraid you'll decide I'm not worth the trouble. I'm afraid you'll look at my world and see only its emptiness, rather than the space I want to create with you. And there it was, the powerful leveling force of mutual vulnerability. In that moment, they weren't CEO and chef, billionaire and village girl. They were just two people facing the terrifying prospect of opening their hearts. Layla stood, moved around the table, and before either of them could overthink it further, she leaned down and kissed him. It wasn't a calculated business move or a dramatic declaration for onlookers. It was a quiet acknowledgement that some risks were worth taking. 6 months after that first kiss, Richard surprised everyone in his elite circle with 4 words that sent shockwaves through high society. We're having a village wedding. While wealthy CEOs typically showcase their status with extravagant ceremonies at exclusive destinations, Richard and Layla were about to prove that true luxury isn't measured in dollars spent, but in authenticity shared. The proposal itself had been characteristically Richard, direct and without pretense. One evening as they closed the restaurant together, he simply looked up from the accounting books and said, "Marry me." No grand gesture, no diamond the size of a small country, just the most important question of their lives asked in the place that had become the center of their shared world. Layla's yes came just as naturally, as though their journey from that first spilled drink to business partners to lovers had always been leading to this moment. What surprised everyone wasn't their engagement, which gossip columns had speculated about for weeks, but rather the wedding they planned. When Richard announced they would hold the ceremony in Layla's grandmother's garden, his board members assumed it was a joke. His executive assistant even pre-booked 3 potential luxury venues, certain he would come to his senses. But Richard remained firm in his decision, explaining it wasn't about rejecting his world, but honoring what made Layla who she was. The garden where she learned to cook is the perfect place to start our life together, he told his baffled colleagues. This wasn't about downgrading. It was about blending their worlds in the most meaningful way possible. The garden transformation began 3 days before the ceremony. Richard insisted on minimal changes. The weathered wooden tables that had hosted family meals for generations remained, though now draped with simple white linen. Strings of warm lights were hung from the ancient apple trees, creating a canopy of stars hovering just overhead. The natural beauty of the space didn't need enhancement from expensive decorations or elaborate arrangements. What made the wedding truly special was how it incorporated elements from both their backgrounds without letting either overwhelm the other. Richard's contribution wasn't financial excess, but rather his genuine embrace of the village traditions. He participated enthusiastically in every pre-wedding ritual, from helping prepare food with Layla's family to learning traditional songs from the elders. The guest list reflected their blended worlds too. Billionaire investors stood shoulder to shoulder with village fishermen. Tech moguls chatted with local farmers. The children of the village weaved between guests, unbothered by wealth disparities that would normally create invisible barriers. On the morning of their wedding, Layla prepared yakisoba in her grandmother's kitchen, not for the ceremony, but because it had become their tradition. Richard joined her, his expensive watch set aside as he chopped vegetables alongside her. This simple act of cooking together on their wedding day symbolized everything their relationship represented: the harmonious blend of different worlds, the prioritization of meaningful connection over status. The ceremony itself began at sunset. Layla emerged from her grandmother's house wearing a delicate lace dress that perfectly balanced elegance with simplicity. Instead of a tiara or extravagant jewelry, she wore wildflowers in her hair gathered from the surrounding fields that morning. As one guest later remarked, she wasn't dressed like a billionaire's wife. She was dressed like herself, which was infinitely more beautiful. Richard waited beneath an archway of intertwined branches, wearing a suit that, while obviously well-tailored, wasn't ostentatious. His eyes never left Layla as she walked toward him, and those closest to the couple later said they'd never seen him look so genuinely happy. Cross-cultural weddings often blend traditions from different backgrounds, showcasing the couple's unique story and values, the officiant noted as the ceremony began. Their vows reflected this blend, Richard promising to never let his world overshadow hers, Layla pledging to remain authentic while embracing their shared future. The emotional peak came when Layla's grandmother rose to give her blessing. The elderly woman, who had once feared losing her granddaughter to a world of wealth, now spoke with pride about how Layla had found someone who valued her for exactly who she was. Tears streamed down her weathered face as she blessed their union in her native language before embracing Richard as family. The reception that followed embodied the intimate wedding concept that studies show often fosters deeper emotional connections among guests. Long tables filled with homemade dishes prepared by the village created a communal dining experience rarely found at elite gatherings. The menu featured Layla's grandmother's recipes, alongside contributions from every household in the village, a potluck celebration that honored the community that raised Layla. Perhaps most remarkable was Richard's comfort in this setting. The billionaire CEO, who could have commanded attention at any high society function, instead sat cross-legged with village elders, listening to their stories with genuine interest. He danced with the children, helped serve food, and at one point joined the village musicians, attempting to play a traditional instrument to everyone's amusement. Research indicates that couples who choose to have simpler, more intimate weddings often report higher levels of satisfaction and happiness in their marriage, observed one guest, a psychology professor who had known Richard for years. This is attributed to the focus on personal connections rather than societal expectations or material displays. As night fell and the garden glowed under the strung lights, Richard and Layla shared a quiet moment away from the celebration. Beneath the same apple trees where Layla had played as a child, Richard whispered, "Now you're officially mine forever." With a playful smile that hadn't changed since their first meeting, Layla replied, "And you're stuck with a stubborn cook for life." The psychological benefits of their wedding choice became immediately apparent. Unlike the stress typically associated with elaborate ceremonies, their day flowed with an easy authenticity. There were no performances for social media, no concern about impressing guests with extravagance. Instead, their wedding celebrated what truly mattered, the unlikely love that had bridged seemingly insurmountable worlds. A respected sociologist attending the wedding noted how the celebration symbolized unity and acceptance across societal barriers. By honoring both their worlds equally, Richard and Layla demonstrated that love doesn't require one person to abandon their identity for another. Their wedding wasn't about a poor girl entering a rich man's world or a wealthy man slumming in simplicity. It was about creating something entirely new that honored both their journeys. As the night wound down, Layla found her grandmother sitting quietly, watching the celebration with peaceful contentment. "Are you happy, grandmother?" Layla asked, joining her on the worn wooden bench. "More than happy," the elderly woman replied, taking Layla's hand. "I'm at peace. I worried he would take you away from us. Instead, he has joined us." This sentiment captured what made their wedding so special. Rather than Richard extracting Layla from her world, or Layla being consumed by his, they had created a third space, a place where authenticity was the only currency that mattered, where wealth was measured in connections rather than possessions. What happens when the world seems to be collapsing around you? Sometimes it's building the foundation for something better. Layla's journey from that humiliating spill to becoming a respected chef and Richard's partner demonstrates how our lowest moments can become catalysts for extraordinary growth. Psychological research confirms this phenomenon. Public humiliation, when navigated with resilience, often leads to greater personal strength and achievement. As individuals learn to face adversity head-on, they develop a growth mindset that transforms challenges into stepping stones rather than roadblocks. In the middle of difficulty lies opportunity. This wisdom perfectly captures Layla's transformation. Her story reminds us that true success isn't defined by wealth or social standing, but by authenticity, determination, and the courage to stand tall in environments designed to make you feel small. By remaining true to herself, while building bridges between different worlds, Layla proved that embracing your roots while reaching for new heights creates the most meaningful kind of success.